Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the third webinar in our pre-conference series. Wherever you're joining us from, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Meena Patel and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's event. These webinars are planned to lead up to the second New Directions in English Language Assessment Latin America Conference, which will be held in July this year. New Directions is a series of conferences which aims to bring together professionals and practitioners all interested in English language assessment. So they could be teachers, researchers, academics, policymakers, come together to discuss issues that are relevant to them on a local or a regional or a global level. We hope that with these webinars, we can explore some of the conference themes, and we can introduce you to some of our lovely speakers and start conversations that we really hope to continue when we meet again in July. Before we begin with the presentations, I'd like to make a couple of introductions. First, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Liliana Forry. Liliana has been instrumental in bringing this event together. You will have seen her name on the end of emails and invitations, and she's worked really hard. So thank you very much, Lily, indeed. And secondly, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Richard Spivey, who works with the British Council Assessment Research Group. Richard is bringing his technical expertise to today's event and managing us all. So thank you very much, Richard, behind the scenes. And now for a little bit of housekeeping. So next slide, please. Okay, so the webinar will be recorded and published on our website next week. So please don't worry about that, just look out for it on our webpage. Certificates of attendance are available, but you do have to request them. So for any questions about certificates or the webinars or the main conference in July, you can just write to the email address on your screen right now. We're using Teams Live for this event and there's no chat function in Microsoft Teams. However, there is a Q&A function and the Q&A is now open. So if you just look at the little icon that's on your screen there, you can post questions for the presenters or the organisers if you wish. Next slide, please. We are extremely lucky to have three fantastic presenters with us today. We have Alberto and we have Erica and we have Edgar. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, followed by maybe about 5 minutes for a couple of questions. And at the end, we'll bring them all together for an open question session. So there'll be time for questions then as well. I'd like to thank all of those participants who sent in questions during registration. We'll try and address some of those if we can as well in today's webinar. Next slide, please, Richard. And I think I've done enough talking for now, so I am going to introduce our very first speaker, who is Alberto Costa. Alberto is Senior Assessment Services Manager for Cambridge Assessment English in the Americas. And as well as doing this amazing job, Alberto is a very dear friend. So thank you for joining us today, Alberto, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Meena, and thank you very much, my colleagues and everyone in the organization of this event. Well, I love talking about assessment, and in my role, this is one of the things we do the most. I work for Cambridge Assessment English in this role with assessment services, and I work for the Americas, but I don't do all this job alone. I work with two other dear colleagues, my counterparts in different parts of the Americas. So Pablo Toledo in the Southern Cone in Andes area, and Rosalia in Mexico and Central America. And the reason why I'm mentioning those colleagues, it's because today I'm going to report on this event that we put together in October for teachers as a request from teachers and coordinators because of their need for support with assessment. This event was also joined by other colleagues from Michigan Language Assessment because we ran quite a few sessions. I'm going to show you the program, and we needed lots of pairs of hands to help put this together, right? So I'm going to ask Richard to change the slides now. Next one, Richard, because this next slide will bring this graph, which is about the potential assessment effects by stakeholder group. Well, this diagram shows all this impact that assessment has in language learning and teaching, and it impacts not only the classroom and the people in the classroom, like the teachers and the students, but the community in general. So we have the parents, we have the educational systems, and it illustrates the impact that tests have on teaching and learning inside the classroom, the micro context, outside the classroom, the macro context, and also it shows the results in stakeholders' behavior as a result of a test that has been implemented in an educational system, right? But I'm going to use this graph here to make this connection with the reality we were all kind of thrown into last year because of the pandemic, right? So even though we are not talking about a specific test, but educational systems were hugely impacted by the pandemic and all the things that we had to make to adjust to the new reality, right? So teachers, students, parents, systems had to adapt, had to make lots of changes in order to address the immediate needs because of this pandemic, and we hope we get out of it very soon. But I would like to draw your attention to the top right-hand corner quadrant where we see the teachers, right? The reason why I'm talking and I will be focusing on teachers for the sake of this presentation, it's because the teachers were the stakeholders we were in touch most of the times. And because of the new changes and because of the generally held perception that assessment has a close connection with classroom tests, teachers had to kind of start teaching and start assessing, but they didn't have the option to provide the students with a classroom test and invigilate them as they were used to doing. So they had to adapt their teaching practices. They had to build their confidence in implementing new assessment processes in their reality. And of course, that demanded a lot of professional development for teaching and assessment practices, but also for the use of the new technology and platforms and everything that was related to those changes. So next, please. We surveyed. When I say we, I mean our institution and a lot of people involved in this. We surveyed many teachers in the Americas in order to find out what their needs were, because we were getting lots of requests for support, especially with assessment. And as a result of the survey, those teachers reported that they needed more tools to measure exam readiness, whether or not students would be ready for a summative assessment, be it internal or external, and they needed diagnostic tools for that. They also felt they needed more academic support for themselves, for their learners, so that they could best support learners in a number of ways, so that would be from planning lessons all the way to setting homework and setting tasks for students, and for how parents could help the students at home. They needed continuous support with webinars, workshops, so we did a number of live sessions, and also they felt the need for more effective continuous assessment practices. This is why, because we were providing loads of local support to teachers, schools, etc., we felt that we would need to put together an event where we could communicate those ideas for a wider audience. So this is why, next please, we discussed a number of issues related to assessment, and some of the key things we noticed was that teachers needed better understanding of what assessment is all about. They need a deeper understanding of what formative assessment takes, what diagnostic assessment was all about, and summative assessment. As I mentioned at the beginning, there was this long-held view that assessment was about giving learners a test, right? So our discussion was aimed at widening this view so that we could provide teachers with thoughts, research, evidence, and practices in assessment. So next, please. This is why our focus for this event was to bring to teachers a lot of information on assessment for learning, most of all considering the importance of feedback in teaching and learning, especially because most teachers were teaching remotely, so they needed to provide a lot of feedback because they wouldn't have the test at the end of the term, and also provide teachers with assessment processes like the assessment for learning cycle, where teachers can map where the learner is now, how can the learners get to a certain goal that they have established or it's part of the curriculum, and find out where the learner is going by using diagnostic tools for that. So next, please. We decided to put together an event, but we felt that because it was a series of webinars, we needed to give it a theme. So we gave it the theme of going on a journey. So we called it Next Stop Assessment for Learning. And that consisted of 5 webinars delivered by our colleagues in the Americas, myself included. So we proposed a route for assessment literacy. So we started with some principles and essentials of assessment for learning, moving on to assessment for learning techniques, talking about the instruments, diagnostic, formative assessment, leading on to success, better success in summative assessment, differences between multi-level, level-based assessments, also moving on to standards in assessment and building confidence in using different assessment practices, and of course providing teachers with a range of resources that are free of charge and readily available for them to implement in their teaching programs, right? So as a result of this event, we managed to impact throughout the 5 webinars over 3,000 teachers in Latin America, and we got a lot of feedback on the event. We also had the post-mortem discussions about the event on things that could have gone better, that we could have done better if we were to do it again. But as part of the conclusions, we felt that, next please, assessment for learning is something that needs still a lot of discussion. We need to bring to teachers a lot of opportunities for professional development in this area so that we can provide teachers with even more assessment literacy. So how can schools and teachers make the best use of assessment for learning? We feel that because of this imposition of the pandemic, we feel that ongoing professional development is key for teachers to implement new assessment practices and change their views on assessment. They need to review and develop their school's assessment policy and practice. We are not in the middle of the chaos anymore, so we can plan a bit more carefully now on how to implement those assessments in our policy. We need to consider better ways of providing written and oral feedback, especially in the context of emergency remote teaching, where this feedback will be very, very important for progress and for success when they come to summative assessment. And of course, we felt that teachers need a lot of support in putting those principles into practice. I mean, it's not something that changes from day to night. It's something that needs trying, getting things wrong, and then trying again, and then getting things right, so that they can better evaluate the impact of those new strategies that are implemented. Well, to finish off, I would like to show you this quote from Brown. This is a view of assessment that we believe in, that assessment is not just a test, but at any moment in the lesson, the teacher can be assessing learners. And if you want to see those events, the videos are available in our social media network, which you can see in the references in the next slide, in our YouTube and Facebook channels in Latin America. And thank you very much for this. I will wait for the questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Alberto. That was really interesting to hear about your project and those lucky teachers that who've been the recipients of those webinars. Great project, thank you.
Thank you.
I haven't seen any questions, Alberto, for you about the presentation. There has been a question from somebody about Cambridge and standards, and I can't name the person because it was anonymous. So I'm going to ask that person to write to newdirectionslatam@britishcouncil.org or to write directly to you, Alberto, at that email address so you can pick that conversation up there. Is that all right?
That's all right, please do.
But I do have a question of my own, if that's all right, on your presentation. And that question is about diagnostic and formative assessment, and whether you think that they will eventually, in this present climate, replace summative assessment. What do you think?
Well, that's a very good question, because we quickly moved from summative assessment being extremely important and the most common practice in many teachers' views, to now using formative and diagnostic assessment more often so that we can better collect data and provide more sound feedback to learners. But diagnostic and formative assessment will not be a replacement for summative assessment. Actually, summative assessment has a very important role in teaching and learning, be it internal or external, because it is a moment when the teachers can see whether learners have reached certain standards in language development, which is our area, right? What is happening, in fact, more and more is summative assessment being viewed as assessment with a formative purpose. So information, results, data gathered from summative assessment can be more and more used for formative purposes, informing teachers what kind of changes, if you may, they can implement in their teaching programs and curriculum.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I don't see any questions at the moment, so if you have any questions for Alberto, please can we save them now for the panel at the end. So let's go on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Erica Balash, and Erica is an assessment consultant, assessment solutions consultant for the British Council Global Assessments team. She's based in Spain, but we are very lucky to have her with us here today. Thank you, Erica. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to the British Council New Directions team for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in as I've already been introduced, so we can go ahead and move to the next slide, Richard. Previous studies have shown that training around the CFR can have a positive impact on both washback and classroom teaching. However, in contexts where it is less familiar, a new framework can cause confusion and undesirable feedback from teachers and possibly even negative feelings or hostility around a new framework. In order for CFR training to have the greatest impact, the session should be informed, taking into account teachers' existing knowledge levels and what they already know. This helps to inform trainers of teachers' confidence levels of their current knowledge, as well as which concepts to prioritize and what's going to be most relevant to those teachers in their classrooms. The British Council regularly delivers training on many topics, including the CFR, prior to which we often send out a pre-activity questionnaire. This presentation will highlight selected responses from two different contexts in which the CFR is used within the national education system and conclude with some considerations for going forward. Next slide, please, Richard. The first context I'd like to look at is my home base of Spain. given the location within Europe, the CEFR can be considered a common currency, if you will. Many teachers are familiar with the framework as it is used in most language education programs, not only English language, but also the standard Spanish DELE exam, German, French, Italian, and so on. This year also marks the 25th anniversary of the bilingual program here in Spain, which is a highly successful partnership between the British Council and the Ministry of Education. Next slide, please. So I want to take a look first at the question around how familiar teachers are with the CEFR levels, and we'll look at Spain first. Given, again, as I mentioned, the location within Europe and the long history of using the CEFR, it's no surprise that the majority of teachers, around 84%, confidently report that they can identify the main features at each level, with just a few teachers struggling with identifying those main features. Next slide, please. The next context I'd like to look at is Malaysia. In contrast, the CEFR is a relatively new concept in Malaysia. Although recently the Ministry of Education adopted the use of the CEFR in the Language Education Reform Roadmap. This also set a professional requirement for teachers to reach C1 level proficiency, and the professional requirement is also C2 for lecturers. Next slide, please. So it's not terribly surprising that within Malaysia, we have a much more diverse response from teachers. The majority of teachers only have a vague idea of what the levels represent, and we have a much higher percentage of teachers admitting that they don't really know what the levels mean at all. Although positively, we do have a small proportion saying that they can identify the main features at each of the proficiency levels. Next slide, please. I'm going to share a preliminary snapshot of some of the survey results we have from teachers in Colombia. Do keep in mind this is a very small sample and that the survey is still ongoing. So in Colombia, the results are somewhat in between those from Spain and Malaysia. The majority of teachers do say that they can identify the main features at each level. But we still have some teachers saying that they have some difficulties. Next slide, please. Prior to conducting our training, we also like to know what kind of CEFR exposure teachers have had, whether they've attended training sessions before or whether they've accessed CEFR material on their own. Here you can see that the distribution is relatively similar across all three contexts. Although in Malaysia, there's a slightly higher number of teachers reporting that they learn about the CEFR from talking to their colleagues. Again, this could be because of that new professional requirement. It might be the hot topic of the break rooms at the moment, or it could also be cascading information. If one teacher attends a workshop, they might be cascading that information back to their colleagues, which I know is a strategy that is in place from the English Language Training Center. You might notice that Spain and Colombia also have slightly higher number of teachers saying that they have accessed the official CEFR document or have read articles or textbooks related to the CEFR. And this might indicate higher levels of confidence in accessing these materials directly themselves. Next slide, please, Richard. The survey concludes with open-ended responses from teachers on what they want to know about the CEFR. These answers provide even greater insight to the current knowledge and what areas should be prioritized in the training. And while there are similarities in both contexts and some common themes throughout, there are also some marked differences in the responses that we'll get to see. Next slide, please. So the last question of the survey asks, what do you wish to learn about the CEFR? If we first look at the Malaysian context, the top two responses were everything, and I don't know, which to me, they're pretty much the same answer. The teachers in Malaysia are lacking some foundational knowledge around the CEFR, and therefore it's difficult for them to articulate and pinpoint what areas are most relevant to them, and it makes it difficult for them to say what might be the most relevant training for them. They've also mentioned that they'd like to know more about what are the core aspects, what are the foundations. Again, asking for some of those core components, what are the basic parts of the CEFR, what do I really need to know? How it can help students, again, also indicating a lack of foundational knowledge, a lack of understanding of why their Ministry of Education has adopted the CEFR and why they have set these standards. And then also 2 responses around making materials for the classroom and creating assessments or exams. And these indicate that teachers are quite keen to learn more and incorporate it into their classroom, but also have a practical application and a practical focus. Next slide, please, Richard. So in Spain, you can see that the answers are slightly different. They're a bit more specific. The top 2 responses were more training on the CEFR, as well as easily accessible information such as videos. Again, indicating a higher level of confidence and being able to access information on their own. Teachers in Spain do have that base knowledge of the CEFR. They're able to identify the main features in each of the proficiency levels, but they're keen to take their knowledge to the next level. They've also indicated a need for more time to read the CEFR firsthand, as well as requesting different levels of CEFR training for new and experienced teachers. This may indicate that teachers have attended multiple workshops on the CEFR, but they might be getting the same content again and again, so that differentiation might be necessary. And teachers have also requested for more modular training on some of the practical aspects of the CEFR. Again, these teachers, once they have the foundational knowledge, might be looking to specialize and either focus on the receptive or productive skills or areas of assessment or whatever it may be. Teachers in Spain are also interested in getting a better understanding of student performance at each level, and they request often banks of benchmark samples. So these could be used to confirm their own student assessments. Next slide, please, Richard. So just to conclude here, given the teacher survey responses, here are some considerations that we are focused on going forward and developing trainings around the CEFR. Number 1 being that teachers are limited for time. They already have heavy workloads as it is, and opportunities for professional development are also limited. And therefore, we're making a bigger focus on offering recorded training events that can either be accessed later or shared with colleagues to foster communities of practice. Also including pre and post activities so that learners can complete these in their own time and also extend the benefits of a single training session beyond just that one-off workshop. There are also a number of existing resources around the CEFR, so much so that it can be very overwhelming, especially if you're new to the CEFR. So as much as possible in the training, we try to include the CEFR documents, appropriate sections or related articles, so that way it makes it easier for teachers to go back and access these documents on their own. And the same goes for resources, and that we provide links that can be accessed independently. And lastly, the training should be practical in nature. All throughout the survey responses, we saw that teachers were very motivated and very keen to learn more about the CEFR, no matter what their level of familiarity was. And once they're familiar with those core components, then they are keen to implement these practices in the classroom straight away. So as we can see from these survey results, simple pre-workshop questionnaires, although often short in nature, are absolutely critical as they highlight areas that are of immediate priority for teachers. Thank you very much. Next slide. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was really, really interesting. we've had loads of questions and a couple of requests. So I'm going to start with the requests for you. One of the participants has asked whether they can use your results for their PhD. So whoever that person is, please can you write to New Directions LATAM, and we can direct that question to Erica so she can liaise with you directly. Frederico has asked what were the open-ended questions and answers in Colombia. Again, do you want that directed so you can deal with that in email?
Yep.
Okay, so one question for now is from one of the participants is, what advice do you have for teachers wanting to learn about the CFR? So you've done all this research, what advice would you give to those teachers who actually want to learn about it?
So the CFR is a very comprehensive document. I mean, it took myself years to actually read the whole thing from beginning to end. So as a teacher, I would try to break it up into whatever sections are going to be most relevant to you, starting perhaps with the theory, but then focusing on the global scales, and then apply that to whatever materials that you have already in the classroom, being able to identify the CFR levels of the materials in the classroom that you're already using. And this is especially important as well because we know a lot of teachers are bringing in authentic materials from outside of the class, perhaps newspapers or magazines or videos off of YouTube, and you want to make sure that those materials that you are integrating into the classroom are at the appropriate CFR level. And then after that, you can incorporate some of the descriptors from the global scales and later on the illustrative scales into your classroom assessments and rubrics.
Excellent, thank you. I'm getting more requests for you and your survey. So for anybody that's interested in the survey that Erica has talked about in her presentation, please can you write to the New Directions LATAM at britishcouncil.org, and we will forward those requests to Erica and she will liaise with you directly on that. I think we've got a couple more questions, but if you don't mind, Erica, I'm going to leave them for the panel. Is that all right?
Yep. That's perfectly.
Thank you so much again. That was lovely. And on to our next speaker, please. Our next speaker is Edgar Picon.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
And Edgar, would you like to introduce yourself or shall I introduce you?
Yeah, please introduce myself. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Edgar is Professor and Research Coordinator at the School of Languages at the Universidad de, is it
Antioquia
in Medellin, Colombia. Very welcome, very warm welcome to you, Edgar. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mina. This next slide, Richard. Yes, as Mina said, I come from Colombia, and actually I live in Medellin, which is the capital city of Antioquia, a state in Colombia. This is the title of my presentation, so I'm going to talk about assessment as learning and consolidating actually an assessment as learning culture. And it's my presentation is I will share with everybody today lessons we have learned from research, actually. That's why I call it a dialogue between theory and practice. Please, next slide, Richard. So this is just for people who are not that familiar with Colombia and Medellin. Antioquia, as you can see on the map, in pink is one of the biggest departments in Colombia next to the coast, or the most of the region is on the mountains, and this is a picture of Medellin, the center of the city. Medellin is a city of contrast. It is the second biggest city in Colombia, and it won a prize in 2013 as the most innovative city. Please go to the next slide, Richard. But it's also a city probably you have heard of because of violence. So we're happy actually that we're changing this image that most people have in the world about Colombia. With prize like the one that we won. And finally, the other photo is from Universidad de Antioquia, where I work. Please, next slide. Okay, the theoretical basis for this, I'm not going to go very deep on theory, but I think it is important to understand what we have defined as a culture of assessment as learning. So it refers to a system, and it refers to dynamic assessment approach that is integrated to teaching, or At least we aim at it to be integrated to teaching, and it articulates complementary procedures thought as a means to potentiate learning. It means it's to a large extent assessment for learning as well. And it's fed by the participants' development and exercise of their autonomy. Of course, this is what we expect it to be. Now, we are struggling to some extent to consolidate this type of culture. So I'm not going to go in detail to every one of those concepts. So let's go to the next slide, Richard. I will jump until the 41 right now. And here, but we do believe, and I think it is important, in ethical and fair assessment practices, and we do believe that this type of assessment supports ethics and supports fairness. And in practice, from the ontological perspective, is practice which is principle-supported, professional. From a theological perspective, is practices that watch for impact, and watch back in this case, because I'm going to talk about assessment in the classroom. And from a dialogic perspective, is practice that involves the students and teachers in constructive dialogue and aims at maintaining equality, liberty, and impartiality in decision making. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a culture, assessment of learning implies many things. So the big one, and Alberto also talked about that, and I think Erika too, is it implies developing knowledge, abilities, and attitudes, which means professional development, LAL, and it means also the possibility to share beliefs and common habits among the participants or the members of a community. My stance in this presentation is that LAL should be fostered through research, and that's why I'm sharing with everybody today some of the conclusions that we have gone that we have driven from our experience carrying out research. So please, next one. So the type of research that I have been involved in is action research, which has a pragmatical perspective and helps bridging the gap between theory and practice, and promotes collaboration and participation among participants. And today I'm talking about mainly classroom research. Please, next. Okay, these are 5 studies. I mean, I have been involved in other studies, but these are the ones from which I took some findings to share with you. Some of them have the actual name in Spanish, so just very briefly, first one is about the development of autonomy, teacher and student autonomy. The second one was about trying to develop through teacher-student partnership assessment on foreign language writing, learner autonomy. Then there was one at the School of Languages aiming at keeping clarifying common criteria and finding and deciding on common criteria in programs, English programs, in continuing education. There was a small one and teaching program at the School of Languages that was in a content course, and the final one that's probably for me at this moment the most important one, because this Sistema de Evaluación from a course called PIFLE probably sounds a little funny for English speaker, but it comes from Spanish as it stands for Programa Institucional de Formación en Lengua Extranjera Inglés of the University of Antioquia, as the EFL program of the university. And this next slide is a very big program that was part of a new policy in the university that has mandate English to be part of all the school programs. So it's part of the curriculum in every one of the different schools in the university. So it has a big impact, and we in that program we have applied many things that I have done before. For example, rubrics has been one of my interests. So regarding assessment procedures, and I have conducted some research with in my own classes, but also with colleagues to design and apply rubrics in their courses. So what we have learned is, okay, as many of those things that we have learned are corroborating what other authors have said before about rubrics, that they are transparent, that they provide support for dynamic assessment, that they serve as a valuable source for self-regulation. It means they support learner assessment. I think it is also very important what we have learned as well, that they can foster democratic processes and constructive feedback, but it depends a lot on how teachers apply rubrics in their classroom. So they need to be shared, they need to be discussed with the students so that students can actually understand criteria and conduct self-assessment and peer assessment. So they increase validity, but they demand clarity in the construct. So in order to have a good and solid rubric, teachers need to study about the what in assessment, which means the construct. In this case, if we are following the EFR, understanding what communicative competences are, for example, right? Please, next one. I'm now very interested in portfolios, and we have found similar things. I'm not going to repeat that, but what's particularly interesting with portfolios is that we have found that they can help articulating complementary assessment procedures. It means in this program, in the PFLE program, we have different types of procedures that complement each other, and the portfolio is like the transversal procedure that helps articulating the other ones. So we have found that it helps, but again, there is the need of professional development for teachers to understand what, in this case, for example, the learner development of autonomy and exercise of autonomy is something needed when we apply portfolios. So teachers need to understand what it is. Please, the following. Okay, so regarding teacher practices, in the beginning, studies show that teachers lack, when they lack LAL, they value practicality over validity, they lack clarity in the discourse. So we found contradictions between discourse and actual practice, and confusion in the assessment construct. And there was an unclear promotion and lack of reliability in their practices. So as I have mentioned before, probably with the implementation of rubrics and research for teachers to not only study and discuss theoretical aspects, but also apply those aspects in their teaching, we have noticed that this has changed a lot. Okay, please go to the next one. So we have found that mainly when teachers are involved in assessment, they develop collegial dialogue, collaborate among them towards a common goal, become more sensitive towards formative assessment, strengthen a theory-practice horizontal relationship, foster reflection upon practice, develop critical thinking, participate more actively in for curriculum shaping, develop a sense of belonging, and their practices increase in terms of validity and reliability. And also they become more conscious of their students' development of autonomy. This is the next one. However, practicality is a problem. And but we have found that practicality can be increased as well after a teacher get involved in research. This picture tries to show that, how they, by gaining knowledge, gaining skills, they move from lack of clarity and lack of confidence, negative feelings, to more positive feelings and positive attitudes. The final one, please. So that there are challenges that we have also found, and the biggest one is practicality because of time concerns. But we have also found the ICTs. When teachers are familiar with ICTs, they help them to overcome those problems. So we consider ICTs need to be integrated to assessment practices. And also that, as I said before, that the autonomy is something that teachers need to understand so that they can go for it. And institutional policies definitely need to support this type of assessment, or it doesn't really take place. It's not going to be successful. Next one. So this is a research that we are now conducting. So there is a big problem in action research, participatory, with a virtual community of practice that aims at teachers to share their experiences. We consider now that that teacher experiences need to be considered and taken into account. And personally, I am very interested in exploring teachers' narratives as a form of professional development. And thank you very much. Next one is just my details. Yes, in case you wanted to contact me.
Thank you very much, Edgar. That was really informative and very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
A couple of questions for Edgar. I'm going to start with one myself, and it was, I think, on a couple of slides ago, you said one of the challenges was ICT, and you quite rightly, I think, said that ICT needs to be integrated into any kind of assessment literacy for teachers. But apart from ICT, Edgar, were there any other challenges that teachers faced when applying the assessment literacy development themselves?
Yeah, and it's not something new again. If you read Brown, for example, he has pointed out that the big challenge is time. That, you know, when you have alternative forms of assessment, that's the big challenge. So teachers face a challenge regarding how to organize their assessment practices when they are going to give feedback which is meant to be constructive. So that's why using ICT sometimes help, but they need to also learn how to organize in small groups and give feedback in different ways, not individual, because they have, many of them have a tendency to give individual feedback all the time, and it's really not working like that.
Okay, thank you very, very much indeed. So we've had 3 great presentations looking at different aspects of assessment literacy for teachers across Latin America and other parts of the world. I'm going to open the floor now to all of the presenters, to Alberto, Erica and Edgar. We have some questions already. So presenters, please just let me know who wants to answer, and then Richard can bring you up on the screen. But Alberto, we have a couple of questions that come through for you, I think, as well. So one question is, formative assessment is not new, we know that. But Frederica would like to know if the tools that you're suggesting for assessment for learning go beyond the linguistic levels of the CEFR and contemplate social skills related to language learning. So you're talking about soft skills.
Yes, when we're talking about assessment for learning, we go beyond formative assessment in the sense that we involve the learners more in this process, hoping to make them more aware of their role in this process. And also there are lots of skills that go beyond the CEFR levels. For example, when learners need to mediate communication, or they need to mediate texts, concepts, etc. Among each other, or when they need to do it if they are leading group work, for example. So lots of social skills that are involved in this process, not only the skills in the CEFR descriptors. Okay,
great. Thank you. Edgar, Erica, if you just want to jump in anytime, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through these questions.
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to add on to that. In the companion volume of the CEFR that was published in 2018, there is an expansion on the descriptors for mediation and interaction, and I found that these are a fantastic starting point for making a rubric or a checklist when teachers are walking around monitoring their classrooms, monitoring classroom performance.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. This is an interesting question, linked a little bit to that. Assessment versus feedback, which is more important?
Is it for any of us?
It's for any of you. Do you want to go through it, Edgar?
Yes, I think feedback is part of assessment. If we understand assessment as an ongoing process, so feedback is just part of it. It's like, I think of feedback as the vehicle that carries somehow washback, or that helps increasing positive washback on learning and also on teaching.
So you're saying, Edgar, that they're not two distinct things that should go against each other. They should work together and should be part of the same system, right?
Yes, that's what I understand. That's not the way I see it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Erica, Alberto, anything on that?
I would just like to say they are so integrated. I mean, you assess and then you collect information, and the way for you to convey the information is through feedback.
And I think that feedback is essential for getting learners to the next step or progressing their learning. Without detailed feedback, they are clueless on what to do next and what areas they need to improve.
Great. Okay, so that feeds very nicely into the next question, which is actually about the CFR and students. So we talked about CFR and teachers. This question is about how can an English teacher implement the CFR frame for students for classes based on speaking and writing? Anybody can take that one.
I'll just briefly mention that one of the great components of the CFR is the self-assessment skills, and so I think it's very important to involve students in their learning, and that's another component of the action-oriented approach. But you can involve students in their own assessment by going through the self-assessment checklist, and sometimes it might even give you more insight to what students can do than your own monitoring of them in the classroom.
Yeah, can I just yes. I would just like to extend to what Erica is saying, because we have the self-assessment scales from the CEFR, and the different descriptors in those scales can be used and can be developed into, for example, rubrics like Edgar exemplified. And we can also consider the descriptors and the components that lead to the descriptor, because descriptor implies that you should be able to do X, Y, Z, but for you to do that, you need to learn types of vocabulary or expressions or lexes or organizing or presentation skills, for example. So you could include the components that lead to those descriptors of performance, and that would be one way of integrating it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Yes, please, Edgar.
Yeah. I think the teacher has a very important role here. Like, if we're talking about rubrics, for example, in how the teacher can shape rubrics, adjust rubrics to something that he or she actually needs going forward, like in terms of communicative competence. So I think it is first needed for teachers to understand what the communicative competence is and to understand the scales so that they can then adjust to their tasks, because scales need to be connected to tasks. So it's not only the scales, but how they are going to connect the writing task to the scale, depending on the level in which the students are. So I prefer to talk about understanding the communicative competence and then going to the scales that going the other way around. Like, you take a look at the scales and just take them just like that to your rubrics, because I think that way is not going to work very well. That's my point of view.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a very specific question for Erica at the moment. So where was the population reached for this survey in Colombia? Was it public school teachers or private schools?
It is a mix, and I would be more than happy to collect more results. I've shared my email address, and I think it will go out in the post-webinar emailing as well, a link to the survey. So please feel free to share with any teachers that work with the CFR that you know of. And I'm also happy, if you're interested to learn more about the results specifically in Colombia, just feel free to email me and I will share that information with you when I have it.
Okay, one last question I think we've got time for. Again, open to anybody. How can the context-independent CFR be operationalized into a specific context? So the idea that the CFR is quite generic, and how can it be operationalized into for a specific system or place?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of understanding the construct, so that and so understanding the language, and then taking a look at in your context what type of teaching approach you're following, for example, and what are the needs of the students. So, to give you an example, at the University of Antioquia, we do a lot of academic tasks. Sometimes we need to adapt those rubrics in terms of what academic competency is, and also trying to meet the needs of the students regarding academic competence, right? For example, they need to write an essay. So what's an essay, and how can we see the different dimensions that are provided by the Common European Framework in this that we call communicative competence. I mean the test, the pragmatic competence, so that we can actually reflect those in a rubric, and that way be able to. That's how I think we can contextualize the Common European Framework to your own needs. It's not a matter of just cut and paste whatever you take from the Common European Framework.
Actually, the CFR does say that you can focus on specific descriptors for your context, and you can also revise your curriculum, etc. now and again to make new adjustments and make perhaps new choices of descriptors that you need to consider for specific contexts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm afraid, I'm really sorry we've run out of time. Thank you, participants, for really, really interesting questions. And thank you to our presenters once again, Alberto, Erica and Edgar, for livening up this webinar with some really interesting and informative presentations, and for answering the questions. So, as somebody said in the chat, eloquently, thank you very much. Richard, if you don't mind, can we have the next slide? So before finishing the webinar, we would like to invite you to join the main conference, New Directions LATAM 2021, from the 1st to the 3rd of July. We will be making announcements very, very soon in early February about the format and the programme, so please keep an eye on the website. I know many of you are keen to hear about the certificates, about whether you can get the slides. The videos will be made available of these presentations next week on our webpage, certificates on request. Finally, a thank you to absolutely everybody, participants, presenters, to Liliana and to Richard for helping. Hopefully we'll see you in July. Please stay in touch with us. Enjoy the recordings, and thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day, the afternoon, the evening. Bye-bye.